Before the Ryzen R5 reviews go live with launch tomorrow, we've got a recap of the news from the last week in the tech field. Of note, some of the items we're talking about today include the Microsoft Xbox Scorpio news as looked into by Digital Foundry. We have a couple of items from Asus, including the overclocking esports, and then MSI's got a new X370 Gaming Pro board added to the AM4 lineup. Before getting to that, this coverage is brought to you by the 1080SC, which has a new MSRP that is lowered with the launch of the 1080 Ti series. The 1080 and 1060 SC cards come with For Honor or Ghost Recon Wildlands, which you can choose at checkout. Learn more at the link in the description below. Microsoft's mid-generation console release, the Scorpio, is our first news item for today. So far, what we know about this is that, first of all, it should be arriving by a holiday of this year, so it's not too far off at this point. And then in the interviews done with Eurogamer, Digital Foundry, and elsewhere, it looks like the Scorpio will be using a 16nm FinFET process, and that's still going to be an 8-core Jaguar chip, along with 40 CUs from the Radeon group, and those will be clocked at 1172 MHz. The refined Jaguar SoC will run 8 cores using x86 architecture clocked at 2.3 GHz, and working alongside the 40 custom Radeon compute units. It looks like the console should have about 6 teraflops of compute power, which puts it somewhere around an RX 480. In terms of memory, the Scorpio also gets an upgrade to 12 GB of GDDR5 shared memory. That is running on a 384-bit bus, and that's capable of about 326 GB per second of bandwidth. Beyond that, it looks like the thing is basically geared towards 4K support, as both or all of these mid-generation console releases have been thus far. So it's looking like 4K is kind of their marketing point. 4K UHD Blu-ray is possible. They showed a demo with Forza running at 4K, theoretically 60 FPS. As for how that 4K is being achieved, we're not 100% sure yet. If it's anything like, it'll probably depend on the game more than anything, whether they're using checkerboard rendering or other rendering techniques to permit the 4K output. But other than that, the only thing left of note is that the Scorpio will be using a vapor chamber for its cooling solution, and then just a standard blower fan, at least from what we've seen so far. So that'll be interesting to tear into if we're able to get our hands on one. Everything else is as expected. It does have an internal power supply. It's still compatible with the Xbox One S and all the other current gen Xbox games, and everything should remain more or less intercompatible, which is an interesting thing with these mid-generation launches, because all you're really gaining are these increases in resolution, because the game developers, if they're going to retain compatibility on all of the current iterations of the console from Microsoft or from Sony, that means they can't just push things like polycount. They've got to push resolution as an option, because it's a lot easier to upscale than to create multiple versions of your game with different visual fidelity and graphics settings. So that's what we're looking at for the Xbox Scorpio, and that's due somewhere around fall of 2017. Back on AM4 news, which we're not going to be able to escape for a while because AM4 is active and there's a lot of stuff going on with Ryzen, especially R5. MSI just added its X370 Gaming Pro motherboard to the AM4 lineup, and this is sort of like a cheaper version of the Gaming Pro Carbon, the RGB board. We've looked at the Intel version. There's also stuff on the AMD side. So the Gaming Pro, the cheaper version of that, it is running what looks to be 2 PCIe 3.0 slots wired as X16 to the CPU, and then one additional PCIe X16 slot for the other devices, AICs and things like that. Storage options include 6 SATA 3 ports, 1 M.2 slot, and that does permit the 32 gigabits per second boosted performance, which of course you are limited more by the storage device at that point, not the storage interface. And beyond that, instead of RGB lighting, they're using static red LEDs. So kind of like the keyboard market where you can buy a fixed LED for cheaper, that's what we're doing on motherboards now apparently, because RGB LEDs add a bit to cost and not everyone wants them, but if you still want LEDs, they're going to do it anyway. These are controllable through the Mystic software that MSI ships with its motherboards. That means that things that are compatible with Mystic for synchronizing the lighting will be compatible with this motherboard as well, although you're limited to just red. And connectivity, you're looking at 2 USB 3.1 ports for the Gaming Pro non-carbon. One of them is Type-C, which is cool news. There are VR Boost USB ports. We'll see if those actually do anything in our new VR testing. And then the usual HDMI and DVI-D. That board should be available sometime this month in April for around $150. which rounds out the X370 market pretty well because most of the stuff we're looking at so far is sort of 200 plus range. So 150 for X370, that's not a bad spot for those to fit in right now. The two storage news items here next, Transcend and ADATA both have new M.2 SSDs. Transcend has a new PCIe M2 SSD. This one is running 3D MLC NAND, and it is based on NVMe 1.2 for the interface with a M2 2280 form factor. This is currently speculated to have an SMI or silicon motion controller, and alongside that we'll have Micron components as well. That's not confirmed, but that's what it looks like right now. In terms of advertised read-write speeds, Transcend is suggesting that they'll be able to do a sequential read-write respectively of 2.5 gigabytes per second and 1.1 gigabytes per second. Of course, the more interesting thing is what does the 4K random look like, especially at those lower Q depths like QD1 to 4, because that's what you'll be seeing in normal Windows or application performance for the most part. This also uses something of a pseudo SLC cache, which is another major challenge in SSD benchmarking, by the way, that we've discovered somewhat just in the past few months, where SLC caching, if you're using traditional benchmark tools, a lot of times they will flood the cache in a way that doesn't happen in real life, and the cache doesn't have time to purge and recover. So over time, you'll see numbers that if you plot them just drop really hard. It's not necessarily representative of real world performance. So that's kind of an interesting side note where SLC caching on SSDs adds a lot of new challenges for SSD benchmarking, hence the renewed focus on latency testing, kind of like you see frame time testing with FPS. So Transcend's got their new device. It is the MTE 850 series, and that's pretty much all the specs we have other than 128, 256, and 512 gigabytes for the capacities. Also shipping 128, 256, and 512 gigabyte devices is ADATA, and that's for their new XPG SX 7000 series. Got to have lots of X's and cool letters and numbers in there, otherwise it's not marketable to gamers. That is going to be an M2 drive, M2 2280 form factor as well. We don't know who the maker of the NAND is just yet. It is probably, well, it's an SMI controller, so it is Silicon Motion, just like the Transcend one looks like it will be. That's using the NVMe 1.2 protocol over M2 for the interface as previously stated. And other than that, it looks like more DRAM pseudo SLC caching going on, and advertised performance is not too far from Transcend's. It's looking like for the 512 gigabyte model of the ADATA drive, they're advertising 1800 megabytes per second sequential read. And then for the sequential write stats, they're looking at 850 megabytes per second. Again, for the flagship 512. Pricing availability is not known yet, but they are going to be offering a 5-year warranty on that device. News from Asus this week includes, one, just kind of a side note, overclocking esports, which seems kind of potentially fun for a lot of people, even outside of the hardcore overclock scene, where you form a team and do overclock and submit your results to the website, and then just rank teams versus the other teams. So that should be fun to look into and follow as it gets going. They also have their new ROG Ariane network adapter. So that is going to be an add-in card adapter, and it will support 10 gigabit per second network speeds. So you plug that into your PCIe slot. It runs on an X4 slot and also hosts a full-size heatsink, which will really be not maybe necessary, but certainly desirable for a 10 gigabit switch if you are actually using 10 gigabit per second networking and have compatible switches in between. That will be compatible with slower network speeds, so if you're running 5 gigabits or 2.5 or something like that, you will have compatibility. Availability looks like sometime later this month, and basically this is something you should be interested in if you're doing any sort of intra-network transfers between multiple machines. So we would do that for our media production, for example, where you might move large files from one machine to the other on the same network internally over LAN. So these cards will be potentially good for that. We might look into one, I'm not sure. We're kind of limited on the Switch, which most people would be. But that's from ROG, along with the overclocking esports. Other than this news, two quick things here. NVIDIA had their Titan XP. We already talked about that in a separate video if you're curious to learn more about it. Basically, it is big Pascal. There will not be a bigger Pascal chip as far as we can tell for this generation. This looks like about the end of it. It is not a GeForce GTX chip, which was stated in our previous content, and it looks like it's being kind of targeted towards Mac, which is interesting because it has the Mac-ready drivers, and it seems reasonable to expect that future Apple products coming out this year might include the Titan, which in that case ditching the GeForce GTX branding could make sense just from a marketing standpoint if Apple doesn't want that on their systems. So that's already been detailed in our previous video. $1,200 card if you buy it separately. G.Skill, meanwhile, has new RGB memory kits, and those will be shipping in capacities up to 128 gigabytes, which would be a 16x8 configuration. The biggest density per stick is going to be 16 gigabytes. So big sticks, and then they have speeds up to 3866 megahertz. We actually have one of these that we used in our Ryzen revisit to try and get the higher speeds that we were getting. So 3866 megahertz, CL18 for that. So the timings on that are 18, 18, 18, 38. That's at 1.35 volts stock, and that is a 16x2 configuration, so 32 gigabytes there. And as for the other kind of high-ish end, you're looking at 3200, 3333, 3466, and 3600 megahertz speeds. And respectively, those are CL15. There's also a CL14 3200 megahertz kit, which we have a Trident Z non-RGB kit that is 3200 CL14, and it's really good. So those are good to look out for. 3333 CL16, that's 16, 18, 18, 38. 3466, 16, 18, 18, 38 as well, and 3600 is 17, 19, 19, 39. All of these kits 1.35 volts, and then in terms of gigabyte capacities, it's mostly 16 gigabyte sticks, although they do also have 8 gigabyte sticks to bring the cost down a little bit. Those are optimized and approved for Z270 and X99. You should probably expect some kind of Ryzen support as well officially, and expected launch is May 2017 with XMP 2.0 built in there. So hopefully not too much work to do. Pricing is unknown right now. And final bit of news for folks in the US, although this is interesting externally as well. The SJ Resolution 36 was signed into law by the president, and that means that was on Monday, April 3rd. So that successfully nullifies the privacy framework that would have been put into place otherwise by the previous FCC group, and basically prevented ISPs from mining customer data without consent. We have some coverage of this on the website. It's unlikely that this will change at this point without a new Congress, Senate, FCC leadership, so that looks like that's the way it's going to be at this point. We have some coverage. So Eric Hamilton wrote several articles on this, and of note, we have another article forthcoming that is about using VPNs, how to set one up, other types of private browsing advice. That'll be in a full feature that publishes probably sometime this week in written format on gamersnexus.net. Speaking of that, as always, you can subscribe for more. Patreon.com/gamersnexus helps out directly. Store.gamersnexus.net if you're a fan, or just check back tomorrow for the R5 coverage. Thank you for watching. I'll see you all next time.